It's time to elevate your photography skills once again with part 2 of mastering your exposures with histograms. Say hello to Myrtle the turtle, who I photographed recently. And I did photograph her on a black background, and as you can see, she's pretty dark herself. But she does have some bright spots on her fur here, as well as her eyes. Now, based on the histogram, we can see the tonal range captured, which includes lots of blacks, shadows, and some mid-tones, and very little to no highlights or whites. So this histogram is vital to understanding them in regards to whether or not you have a proper exposure. Let's look at another image to further explore and understand the histogram, and you will soon realize what this histogram is telling you. So this next image here I captured on a family vacation in northern Michigan of all places. So let's check out the histogram for this image. So it looks like I captured detail in all 256 bars, or the full dynamic range of the scene. So would you agree that this image is properly exposed? Great. The only problem is that was a trick question, since this is the histogram of the final edit. Now here's the histogram of the image straight out of the camera, and it looks like a lot of the bars are missing in the blacks and some in the shadows. So this is an indication that the photo is overexposed. And here's that same image straight out of the camera with no editing. And it does look overexposed, wouldn't you agree? So if I had reviewed the histogram before packing up, I could have retaken the photo to get the correct exposure. This would have resulted in a higher quality image, and it would have saved me some time editing. Now it's time for you to elevate your photographic skills with the following information. Are you ready? Good, because this is what's going to separate you from every other photographer on this planet. So here we go. So only looking at the histogram by itself isn't enough. It is only confirmation of what you see prior to creating your photo. So before you click that shutter release button, you first have to visualize your final image. So what do I mean by that? Well, you have to see the subject you want to capture, and you have to see the light in order to determine your exposure. And that simply means you have to see the dynamic range or the brightness levels of that light throughout your scene. For example, in this image, it's very bright along the horizon, and it gets darker on the way up, and then the sand here is fairly bright as well. But the tree itself is darker than the sky and the sand. So we have a shadow down here of the tree and darker areas within the tree as well. Therefore, we have some blacks and shadows in and around the tree, and in the sand and the sky, we have some midtones up here. Then we have some highlights here inside the sand. And then we have our whites along the horizon, and then some whites and highlights on this end of the image as well. So seeing all 5 zones before you take the photo tells you that if you want to capture detail in the full dynamic range of your scene, you will need a histogram that has bars in each tonal range. If not, and it looks like this, then you know your image is overexposed. But if the histogram looks like this, then you know it's underexposed. Or is it? Remember Myrtle the turtle? She had a histogram that looked like this one, and here it is again. But we know, based on the dynamic range of that scene, there will be more bars on the left side of the histogram and little to none on the right side. That is why it's important to see the brightness levels of your scene so you know what to look for in your histogram to ensure you're getting the exposure needed for your creative vision. Our next image is another family member, and his name is Fuzzy Bunny. This time we have a mostly white bunny on an all-white background. And as you can see, Fuzzy has some light gray spots, and his eyes are almost pure black. So picture in your mind what the histogram should look like. Is this what you had imagined? Awesome, because as you can see, this time the bars are heavier on the right side where the highlights and whites are. and we have some information or detail in the midtones, and very few to none in the shadows and blacks. So remember, the histogram will confirm what you see before you take the photo, and if the histogram matches those brightness levels, then you should have a properly exposed image. So far, we've explored the tonal ranges within a histogram, and you now know what to look for to confirm you have the right exposure. But the histogram can also warn you if the scene exceeds the dynamic range of your camera. So remember, your camera only has 7 to 14 stops of dynamic range. Let's look at some histograms that give you a warning if you've exceeded the dynamic range of your camera, and then this will help you decide if you should expose to the left or to the right, or if you should control the light by diffusing it or by other means. So here's another image of Murdo the turtle. This image is much darker than the first one I showed you, and the histogram is even heavier on the left side versus before. Notice how the bars are bunched up to the left side? This is your warning that detail is being clipped, or in other words, you're losing detail in the black tones and possibly the shadows. And this would be considered an underexposed image. What you want to see instead is this histogram, and notice how the bars on the left side are not as heavy or bunched together as the underexposed image. So a good rule of thumb is to ensure there is little to no gap on the left side and or the right side. And of course, that all depends on the dynamic range of your scene. All right, so an overexposed image is going to be the opposite of the last one. So the bars will be bunched together on the right. If you see this, adjust your camera settings until your histogram has little to no gap on the right side. All right, so the one thing we haven't covered yet that you might be wondering about is the height of the bars. In our vacation example, the height of the bars changed based on how many photos were taken each day. The bars in your photos histogram can also change heights based on the brightness levels. So if there's a predominant brightness level, you'll see a spike for that specific tonal range. So for this image, I photographed the couple against a dark wall. And the histogram for this image shows a huge spike in the blacks and shadows. This is where the majority of the background brightness levels are located. And as you can see, the bars for the midtones, highlights, and whites also have data, but the bars are much shorter since there are fewer details in those ranges. All right, guess what time it is? That's right, it's Parker time. No, not really. It's time to elevate your photographic skills by taking full creative control over your camera by learning how to shoot in full manu mode. In other words, no more auto modes, which will require manually setting your ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. It's easier than it sounds, and you'll discover how by starting with episode 13.